I stood just outside the kitchen entrance at the Avalon Estate ballroom, my fingers lightly touching the edge of the curtain. Behind it, laughter bubbled like champagne, young, bright, careless. My son's bride, Brooklyn, stood in the glow of the chandelier, her hand cupped around the stem of her glass, her lips close to her friend's ear. "She's almost 70 and starting to slip," she whispered, swirling her drink. "In 6 months, we'll have her declared unfit. Then the place in Santa Cruz is ours." They both laughed, sharp, private, like girls trading secrets. I didn't blink. I didn't gasp. I turned slowly and walked to the bar, my heels tapping across the marble like nothing had changed. I ordered a vodka tonic with a twist of lime and smiled like a proud mother-in-law should. I complimented the band. Admired the flowers. Nodded graciously to the guests. And all the while, I kept hearing her voice. "She's almost 70. Unfit. Ours." I was 68. Still wore heels. Still did my taxes by hand. Still remembered the exact birth weight of my son, the one who used to fall asleep on my chest and now stood laughing with a woman who called me a liability. I sipped my drink, let the cold sting of vodka settle behind my ribs, and reminded myself, quietly, clearly, that I had raised Ethan. And Brooklyn had no idea what I still had in me. Brooklyn had entered our lives like a gift-wrapped solution. That's how Ethan described her, anyway. "Mom," he said over a late brunch one Sunday, "this is Brooklyn. Isn't she amazing?" I remember how he beamed, how he watched her for cues even as he introduced us. "She's a counselor. Family systems coach. You two are going to get along so well." I smiled politely. I poured her iced tea. Brooklyn smiled back, all warm eyes and gentle inflection. She folded her hands just so. "I just love helping people feel balanced," she said. "So much of what we carry is generational, you know. We inherit more than we realize." I nodded. Sipped my tea. But something inside me shifted slightly. I used to sit in conference rooms filled with men twice my age and 3 times as loud, running circles around them with a spreadsheet and a steely gaze. I retired at 60. I know what strategy looks like, even when it's wrapped in lavender and praise. Brooklyn started redecorating Ethan's guest house before I'd even had time to offer her a second glass. "It's a little sterile in here," she said, smoothing a palm over the armrest of my mother's old wingback chair. "You don't mind if I feng shui the energy a bit?" It wasn't a question. It was her way. She began leaving books on the coffee table, titles with names like Unburdening the Matriarch and The Freedom of Letting Go. "I thought you might enjoy these," she'd say sweetly. "A little soul care for strong women in transition." In transition from what, exactly? She never said. By the second month, she was calling Ethan's bedroom their sanctuary space and suggesting I install soundproofing so we all have healthy boundaries. She rearranged my pantry, labeled my spices, and told me my rose garden could use a little symbolic pruning. I listened. I watched. And I waited. It was over lunch one afternoon that she brought up my will. We were sitting on the back porch. The jacarandas were in bloom. Brooklyn wore a linen jumpsuit and a carefully unreadable expression. "So," she said casually, buttering a croissant, "I was just thinking, it might give Ethan peace of mind to have things settled. You know. For when the time comes." "The time." I smiled. "I plan on being around for quite a while." She laughed. Touched my wrist. "Oh, of course. You're so vibrant. I just meant that transitions are smoother when there's clarity. And trust." She let the word hang there. Trust. It wasn't the first time she'd used it like that. Like it meant one thing to me and something else entirely to her. Later that evening, I opened a bottle of Chianti and called Sandra, my attorney. She's circling, I said. Like a hawk. Sandra exhaled. Time to protect your nest, June. We met the next morning. I gave her access to every document, every ledger, every account I'd ever touched. Sell both properties, I said. The beach house, too. Sandra looked up. You're sure? Brooklyn thinks the beach house is hers. That alone is reason enough. And so we did. Quietly. Under my maiden name. Through a trust no one had reason to notice. Ethan, meanwhile, moved into one of my rental units in Sausalito. Just until Brooklyn's practice is more stable, he said. We're building a life, Mom. On borrowed brick and good intentions? I asked. He didn't laugh. Brooklyn, ever the diplomat, brought over quinoa salad and a book on boundaries. We don't want you stressed, she said. Maybe we could put the Santa Cruz place in Ethan's name. Just for peace of mind. The same words. Peace of mind. That night, I switched banks. I created new passwords. And I ordered a locked file cabinet for the study. Then, I waited. Because if there's one thing Brooklyn underestimated, it's that a woman who spent her life balancing risk and reward knows exactly when the storm is coming. And how to prepare. The ambush came on a rainy Tuesday, just after noon. The kind of rain that taps the windows with delicate persistence, like a warning too polite to be taken seriously. I'd just finished steeping a pot of Darjeeling when the doorbell rang. One long chime. No knock. I opened the door to find 3 people on my porch. Ethan, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like a schoolboy who's rehearsed a confession. Brooklyn beside him, wearing pale gray cashmere and a smile of unbearable softness. And behind them, a man in a tan overcoat with a leather bag and a badge clipped discreetly to his lapel. June, Brooklyn said, her voice all sympathy, this is Dr. Raymond Kelly. He's a licensed geriatric psychiatrist. We've asked him here because we're concerned. I stared at the man. He gave a nod, like this was routine. We've noticed some changes, Brooklyn continued gently. Selling properties without discussing it. Repeating stories. Forgetting appointments. Last week, you called Ethan Elijah. I was quoting scripture, I said. She blinked. Even so, it's been noticeable. Ethan stepped forward. Mom, it's just a check-in. A 72-hour evaluation. You've always said health comes first. Health. That word, so often used as a blade. And if I refuse? I asked. Brooklyn looked almost hurt. Then we may have to file a formal petition. Ethan and I have already spoken to an attorney. It's not ideal, but if you're declared medically unfit. I raised my hand. Enough. They quieted. I walked calmly to the bedroom. Packed a bag. A book. A toothbrush. A slip of paper with 3 phone numbers. Then I returned to the front door. Let's go. The ride to Golden Hills Behavioral Center was quiet. I sat in the back, watching the gray blur of the highway, hands folded neatly over my lap. Once inside, I cooperated. I answered their questions. I smiled when appropriate. I took their tests. And I passed every one. Better than passed. I impressed them. They asked if I'd consider leading a workshop on financial literacy. I declined, politely. Instead, I made 3 calls. One to Sandra, just to say everything was in motion. One to my bank in Montana, confirming the new accounts. And one to Detective Caleb Rowe. I need a full background check on Brooklyn May Whitaker, I said. Fast. Quiet. Every alias. Every city. Every skeleton. There was a pause. Then his low drawl came through the line. Thought you'd never ask. I'll dig. Caleb had once owed me a favor. Years ago, he'd been a fledgling forensic accountant caught in a scandal involving a hedge fund I helped dismantle. I had vouched for him. Kept his name out of the papers. Now, I needed a return on that investment. 3 days later, a manila envelope arrived at the front desk of Golden Hills with no return address. Inside, everything. Brooklyn had changed her name twice. Been sued for financial coercion in Arizona. Charged, though not convicted, of exploiting an elderly client in Nevada. A sealed juvenile record out of Wisconsin. A still active warrant under an alias in Utah. And the photos. One in particular caught my eye. Brooklyn, maybe 5 years ago, holding hands with a man I didn't recognize, walking out of a courthouse. He was older. Pale. Frail. I flipped to the back. Victor R. Linwood, deceased 2019. Cause of death, fentanyl overdose. The last 3 checks written from his account. All to cash. All signed in a different handwriting. She wasn't new to this. She was practiced. When Ethan and Brooklyn returned to pick me up, I greeted them with open arms. Dinner at my place. I suggested. To thank you for caring. Brooklyn smiled, radiant. Of course. We're just so relieved you're feeling better. They arrived at 7 sharp. Brooklyn in a silk blouse. Ethan wearing cologne I hadn't smelled on him since college. Hopeful. Nervous. I poured them wine. In the den, Detective Rowe waited quietly with 2 plainclothes officers. When Brooklyn stepped inside, he stood. Brooklyn May Whitaker, he said calmly, you are under arrest for financial exploitation, identity fraud, and attempted coercive control under California's Elder Justice Act. Ethan froze. Brooklyn didn't flinch. You'll regret this, she said, her voice suddenly cold. Ethan and I are a team. No, dear, I said, meeting her eyes. You were a parasite. He's waking up. She said nothing as they cuffed her. Just tilted her head and gave a little smile. One that said the story wasn't over. Ethan stood in the foyer, not moving. His glass still in hand, the wine untouched. He looked at me like a child waking from a fever dream. Mom, he whispered. What just happened? I handed him the folder. Read. Slowly. He sat down. And read. Not all at once. But all the way through. Brooklyn was denied bail. The charges were severe, the judge unimpressed by her lawyer's soft-spoken pleas. Elder abuse statutes in California carry weight, especially when there's documentation, multiple identities, and a manila folder handed off in a quiet courtroom by a retired hedge fund manager with perfect recall and nothing left to lose. The trial is set for November. I won't attend every day. Just enough to remind her I'm watching. Ethan moved out of the Sausalito rental within the week. Brooklyn's things stayed behind. He left the rose-colored diffuser, the stack of therapy workbooks, the ceramic bowl filled with amethyst. Just walked away. Left a note on the counter for the next tenant, don't ignore the little signs. He rented a studio apartment. Small. Sparse. His name on the lease, his paycheck covering the rent. He calls me on Sundays now. Not out of guilt. Not yet love, either. Something between obligation and remorse. I answer. I don't always stay long on the phone. But I listen. One afternoon, he said quietly, she told me you hated me. That you said I'd never amount to anything. I waited a beat. Did you believe her? He didn't answer. Not with words. Eventually, he said, I miss the sound of you stirring your coffee with a spoon. You always did that, even when we had stirrers. I said, that was so I wouldn't forget I was still here. Silence. Then, I'm sorry, Mom. I wanted to say it was okay. That it wasn't his fault. That love sometimes wears disguises. But I didn't. Instead, I told him the truth. You'll have to earn your way back. He said, I know. And I believed him. Brooklyn sent a message through her attorney 2 weeks ago. Said she was misunderstood. Said her childhood was hard. Said she never meant to cause harm. Asked for compassion. Then, in a line that made me set the letter down and walk around the house in silence, perhaps June could visit me. I still think of her as my second mother. I laughed for the first time in months. Second mother. As if she hadn't tried to have me declared incompetent with a smile and a flute of champagne. I didn't reply. Some stories don't need an ending. Just a door that closes. The Santa Cruz house sold for well above asking. A young couple bought it, expecting twins. The husband cried when they signed. Said it was their dream. I left a note in the top drawer of the linen closet, protect each other. And the house will protect you in return. I kept only a few things, the rosewood box Ethan made in shop class, my wedding china, and the ledgers from the fund I built. Everything else, I gave away. Now, I live in a quiet cottage on the Oregon coast. It's not large. But it's mine. The walls are cream, the floors wide plank. I planted rosemary by the back steps, and at night I light candles with no occasion at all. Above the fireplace, I framed the lease Brooklyn tried to forge. It hangs like a portrait. A reminder. Not of her. But of me. Of who I became when I stopped explaining myself. Of the moment I learned that dignity doesn't raise its voice. It simply leaves the room with its head high, and never returns. Sometimes, late in the evening, I sit on the porch with my tea and watch the tide come in. I don't wonder what could have been. I don't mourn what didn't last. I just let the sea speak. It says, you survived. It says, begin again. It says, you are not too late. The wind rustles the lavender. The candle flickers. And I breathe deep and unafraid. Once, I was almost erased. Now, I am written in bold. One morning, a letter arrived. No postmark. Just a name scrawled in blue ink across the envelope, Ethan's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Still neat, still deliberate. But the curve of the J in June was hesitant now, like he wasn't sure I'd want to see it. Inside was a single page. Mom. I've started going to meetings. Not just for her, but for me. I didn't know how deep it had gotten. How much of my life I'd handed away in the name of keeping the peace. You were never the problem. I see that now. I'm ashamed of what I let happen. I'm ashamed that I didn't protect you. I found the photo of us at the beach. You were holding my hand, and I was crying because the waves scared me. You weren't scared. Not even then. You've always been braver than I knew. If you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Love. Ethan. I read it twice. Then a third time. And I folded it gently, placing it in the drawer beside the old Polaroid he mentioned, the one with my hair wind-tossed, my son clinging to me, and my smile bright despite the tide. I didn't write back. Not right away. Sometimes silence is its own answer. Not rejection. Just pause. Just breath. A week later, a small package arrived. Inside was a music box. One I hadn't seen in years. It had once belonged to my mother, then to me. I thought it lost. Brooklyn had said it was damaged beyond repair. But here it was, cleaned, polished, and playing a soft, warbled lullaby when I turned the key. Inside the lid, Ethan had written in tiny script. "I found this in the attic." She'd hidden it in a box labeled "Donate." That night, I sat by the window with the music box in my lap and cried, not out of grief, but out of something harder to describe. That strange ache that comes when a wound begins to close. Not healed, but beginning. The trial moved quickly. Brooklyn's plea deal was rejected. Too many victims. Too much documentation. Too many inconsistencies in her story. Her lawyer argued emotional distress. Childhood trauma. Economic pressure. The jury listened. And then they chose accountability. Sentencing is in December. She could serve 5 years. Maybe less with good behavior. It's not enough. But it's something. Ethan wrote again after the verdict. Short this time. "I'm thinking of driving up. I won't stay long. I just want to see your garden. And maybe hear that old wind chime again. I miss the sound of it." I waited 3 days before responding. "Bring gloves. The rosemary's overgrown. And I could use help with the lavender." I didn't say I forgave him. I didn't say I didn't. But he came. Not all at once. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone stepping back into a house after the fire has long since burned out but the walls still remember the heat. He knelt beside me in the garden, pulling weeds with a quiet diligence that told me everything he couldn't yet say. Later, we sat on the porch. He looked older. So did I. He reached into his pocket and held out something small. A matchbox. Charred at the edges. Lavender scented. "The candle you used to light when Dad died," he said. "The one you always said smelled like memory." I nodded. "I kept one," he said. "When we moved out of the Sausalito place. I didn't know why. I just couldn't throw it away." I took it from his hand. Ran my fingers along the burned edge. And I said, finally, "Some things are worth keeping. Even when they hurt." He nodded, eyes wet. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed. It no longer carried weight. Only space. That night, I lit the candle. Just for a moment. Then I opened the window and let the wind carry the scent out to sea. I stood there, arms folded, breathing in rosemary, salt, and forgiveness. I whispered his name once. Softly. Just to hear how it felt. "Ethan." And the sea answered, as it always did, not with sound, but with movement. Endless and patient. Like healing. Like love that had remembered its shape. A month after the sentencing, I received a handwritten letter postmarked from a women's correctional facility in Northern California. I knew the writing. Narrow loops. Overly neat. Brooklyn. I didn't open it. Instead, I tucked it into a drawer beside the music box Ethan had restored and the worn recipe card with his father's favorite bread pudding, stained from years of cinnamon and cream. Let the past rest where it belonged. It was mid-October, and the wind carried that early bite of winter along the coast. I was kneeling in the garden, pruning the rosemary, when I heard the gravel crunch. I looked up. 6 women stood at the gate, hesitating. Each wore a windbreaker and clutched something: canvas bags, notebooks, paper boxes. One stepped forward. "Are you June Holloway?" she asked, breathless from the hill. "I am," I said, brushing soil from my knees. She smiled, eyes shining. "I'm from the foundation your attorney created. The Holloway Fund for Women at Risk. You're listed as our founder." I blinked. Slowly stood. Sandra must have followed through. I'd asked her to set aside proceeds from the Santa Cruz sale. Discreetly. To help women, mothers, grandmothers, facing coercion, financial abuse, forced dependency. She said we could learn from you, the woman added. That you might share your story. That maybe, you teach us how you survived it. I didn't speak for a long moment. Then I opened the gate. Led them into the garden. Boiled a pot of tea with rosemary and mint. And as we sat in the quiet circle, steam curling between us, I told the truth, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I told them that strength isn't loud. That some of the fiercest battles are fought in silence, around kitchen tables, behind closed bedroom doors, in the stillness after a cruel sentence spoken in your own home. And that love, real love, does not ask you to disappear to prove it. One of the women wept. Another touched my hand and whispered, "You remind me of my mother." Before they convinced her she was losing her mind. I smiled, soft and full. Because I was not lost. I was not broken. I was not erased. I was here, in a home I chose, surrounded by rosemary and wind, telling a story that once nearly swallowed me whole. And now it set others free.